Heroes come in all sizes. But adventure doesn't come any bigger than this.
Adventure doesn't come any bigger than this, as today we're talking about Willow, an old favorite movie of mine from childhood. But more specifically, let's get into the handful of video games based on the fantasy epic from Lucasfilm. Willow Ufgood's journey would find adaptations on a variety of gaming platforms around the time of the film's release, even despite lower than expected box office and critical receptions. And we ended up with 3 wildly different titles before the franchise would drift off into inactivity. Or at least until that recent short-lived TV series anyway. So let's consult the bones, stock up on magic acorns, and embark on our quest through every Willow game. The first Willow game to be released was developed and published by Mindscape in 1988 for the Atari ST and DOS, the version you're seeing here, and the one I played through in its entirety. Ports for the Commodore 64 and Amiga would follow in 1989, with all 4 versions sharing the same concept and gameplay content, but each with their own slight differences in graphics and sound capabilities to be expected. It's essentially a collection of minigames, which each recreate different scenes from the film, all of them accessible through this lengthy scroll that chronicles a condensed summary of the plot, and clicking on any words in bold text will start up a game based on a particular scene. It's honestly kind of a fun way to present everything, and it ties things into the film pretty nicely, even if several characters and elements of the story are glossed over or omitted entirely. If you click on Willow's name first, it initiates the main quest mode of the game, where you can play through each sequence in order, with 8 lives to complete them all, and eventually face off with the evil Queen Bavmorda herself. Or if you skip ahead in the scroll, you can practice each minigame individually as much as you like. Which you'll definitely need to do, and we'll get into the reasons why on some of these. The first game drops you into the dungeons of Nockmaar Castle, where you play as the Daikini midwife Ethna, who is trying to escape with little baby Alora Dannon, a child of prophecy who is key to the downfall of Bavmorda. We have a first-person perspective here reminiscent of Shadowgate, but don't expect any interactivity at all beyond clicking on various exits, as any objects lying about seem to be purely to aid you in navigation and for differentiating the many rooms. Step into the wrong room and you'll be trapped, or if you take too much time to decide where to go, or too many wrong turns, and you'll be captured by soldiers. And finding the correct route is purely trial and error tedium, so expect to spend a considerable amount of time figuring out the only safe path and get out that pen and paper. Luckily, that route doesn't change, so once you've got it mapped out, you shouldn't struggle with this section ever again. The second game is a bit more action-focused, and has you controlling Willow taking Alora through the forests of Nockmaar on the way to the Daikini crossroads. You can run in 8 directions and have to navigate the various pathways through the woods, all while avoiding randomly appearing soldiers and death dogs. If they get too close for comfort, you can also throw one of your 3 magic acorns at them to turn them to stone. But otherwise, any contact with them will result in failure. You can move fastest along the path, but sometimes it's in your best interest to take shortcuts through the grass, or possibly find more acorns off the main road. This is a pretty short minigame to complete, and probably the easiest one of the bunch. And if you're playing the quest mode, once you reach the crossroads, you must pick between one of 2 crow's cages to see which one holds Madmartigan, the mercenary who joins Willow on his adventure, where they soon encounter the good sorceress Fin Raziel. Which brings us to spellcasting, a recurring minigame throughout the quest mode, where you must transform Raziel into the correct animal in order to keep the story going. Here you have 13 runic symbols to choose from, where 3 of these symbols must be clicked on in the correct order. So get out that pen and paper again, as you'll just need to randomly click on these things to get the right combination, with no real hints or clues to speak of. The only thing kind of letting you know you're on the right track is that one of the 3 symbols will transform 1/3 of Finn's body, and the wrong order will create all sorts of weird, cursed-looking critters, which are honestly kind of fun to discover despite them failing you out of the game. Next up, we have another maze to figure out in the Ice Caves, where Willow and Madmartigan are sledding on a shield through a cold labyrinthian colon. Gameplay here is very similar to the dungeon minigame, except this time you're constantly propelled forward with no means to back up. You'll need to hold a directional key in the desired direction instead of clicking, but again, you will need to spend considerable time finding the one singular safe route of escape, with tons of forks in the tunnel leading you to dead ends. This one can get a bit frustrating to map out, but luckily, like the dungeons, the route never changes. Once you pop out of the caves, you'll need to transform Finn Rizal again, and then enter into the battle minigame, where you take control of Mad Mardigan in the final assault on Nockmar Castle, first avoiding an onslaught of arrows, spears, and barrels by ducking or jumping accordingly, and slowly hobbling forward to a face-off with General Kale. You don't really have any means of defending yourself, so you basically just need to try and find a safe position where you can slash away at him repeatedly, while trying not to get hit enough times to die. And I don't know if this is the fault of DOSBox or not, but the graphics get pretty glitched out here, but it's still playable. Other ports did not seem to have this problem on this minigame. And if you can manage to take out Kale and you're in the quest mode, you'll finally need to transform Finn Rizal into human form with one more spellcasting game, and then you can move on to the epic showdown with Bavmorda, the one minigame that cannot be played in practice mode. And it's essentially the spellcasting minigame again. Just this time around, you have to cast a spell with 9 correct symbols instead of 3, which still need to be in a very specific order, and with each incorrect guess letting Bavmorda make one step closer to destroying Allura on the sacrificial altar. And I might sound like a broken record by now, but with enough trial and error, you'll figure it out, and then be rewarded with triumph, beat the drums, music, and revelry. So in giving my honest take here, this game is kinda bad, but I will admit I had fun anyway, playing through it on stream and even completing a deathless speedrun. And I welcome anyone to bop my time on the newly created leaderboard. And I have to commend the attempt to faithfully recreate specific moments of the movie, and the whole setup with that scroll was a pretty nice touch. And the graphics are fine. There are plenty of gloriously dithered stills from the film scattered throughout, even with a few extra ones if you're playing in the quest mode. But where it fails pretty hard is the tedious and woefully basic game design that boils down to pure trial and error in the maze games and spellcasting outcomes. But to its credit, if you really want more replay value out of this, there's actually a built-in randomizer, where if you select the Mindscape logo at the end of the scroll, you can reset various settings, and in the words of the instruction manual, create a fresh game experience. It's something, I guess, but you'll again just be navigating blindly and ruling out the wrong paths or symbols, which is still kinda drudgery in the end. And sadly, the 2 action sequences are so short in comparison, there isn't a whole lot of meat on the bone here. And touching briefly on the other ports, they all have the same mini-games and content, and even generally reuse the same assets, but with the obvious slight differences in sound and graphics per computer platform. But the main problem I was running into while testing these was atrocious loading time on all 3 of the other versions, sometimes with several minutes passing by just to load a single minigame. So I would strongly recommend the DOS version for actual playability, and maybe just check out the other ones out of curiosity.
Willow.
The next Willow game to be released was an action platformer exclusive to arcades, developed and published by Capcom, first hitting Japan in June of 1989 and other regions in the months following. It was the 5th game released on their now iconic Capcom Play System line of arcade boards, following titles like Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, and Forgotten Worlds, with several design elements and concepts from those classic titles melded together here, luckily with much better results than a failed attempt at the spellcasting minigame we saw earlier.
Kill me.
The attract mode and introduction of the game catches you up with the story from the film, and we again have a somewhat rare example of a video game adaptation being pretty faithful to the source material throughout the game's 6 stages, bringing in lots of characters, locations, and moments from the movie, with a few embellishments and completely new enemies thrown into the mix at times as well. But all with a really nice and colorful presentation, the high standard of quality that could be expected from Capcom's arcade games at the time. Level 1 kicks off with you in control of Willow himself as he makes his way to the crossroads. You can run, jump, slide, and fire magic projectiles, along with the ability to charge up your magic attacks with a variety of outcomes. As you defeat enemies, picking up the gold coins they drop is very important down the road, as you'll be able to do some shopping along the way to purchase a variety of restorative and defensive items, but more importantly, offensive upgrades. Willow's standard magic attacks will not only get stronger, but his meter can be lengthened and charge-up shots can set off all sorts of different spells, including tornadoes, explosions, turning enemies into gold, freezing time, or even a powerful crystal shield. You're definitely not going to want to skip over these purchases, or you're going to start having a really hard time later in the game without them. Platforming feels pretty good here as well. You have 2 different jump heights at your disposal, along with being able to grab ledges, and there are a few occasional precarious moments here and there, but overall I'd say the stronger emphasis is on running and gunning. Luckily, you do get a few health points to survive all of this, but continuing will drop you back to a checkpoint. There's also a pretty harsh time limit per life, which even ticks down while you're in a shop, so you'll need to keep an eye on that clock while gathering up enough money to stay upgraded enough to have a fighting chance later in the game. After you meet Mad Mardigan at the end of level 1, you get to play as him in the following stage, and throughout the remainder of the game there are often character swaps as you progress, or even a stage where you can choose who to play as. Naturally, as the greatest swordsman who ever lived, you have a very cool Strider-coated sword slash attack, which can also be charged up for longer range, and similar jumping and sliding maneuvers that we had with Willow. The upgrades are also in play here, as you can and really need to buy more powerful swords in the shops. Another notable difference in the Mad Mardigan gameplay is how you can destroy projectiles with your attacks, which becomes very helpful as level 2 wraps up with the cart chase scene from the film, where you must defend yourself from hordes of death dogs, soldiers, and pesky archers. Level 3 takes us to Finrazel's Island and back in control of Willow, and here you'll encounter many new and troublesome enemy types and a substantial difficulty spike, especially if you haven't been keeping up with those upgrades. The raft ride here reminded me a lot of the second level in Super Ghouls and Ghosts on the Super Nintendo, which came out 2 years later. And eventually, you'll battle a very enthusiastic wizard who is unique to the game. The 4th stage switches back to Mad Mardigan again as you ascend a snowy mountainside to reach Sorsha's camp and fight a rather random dragon mini-boss, but ultimately you'll face off with Sorsha herself in a sword fight and then slide your way back down the other side of the mountain in a fun little coin-grabbing minigame. And next is Tirazleen Castle, the one level where you can choose your character, and it consists of a fun action-packed stage full of puking trolls and my favorite creature from the movie, the vile two-headed Eborsisk. Fun fact, George Lucas named this thing after the film critics Siskel and Ebert. No wonder they gave this movie 2 thumbs down. Finally, we reach the last stage, Nockmaar Castle, with the first half of the stage putting Mad Mardigan through a maze-like gauntlet with a selection of doors at the end of deadly hallways, with the wrong choice sending you backwards in progress. Once you take down General Kale, you'll switch back to Willow to climb your way up to Bavmorda's ritual chamber, where your magic-wielding skills will truly be tested. I'm sorry to say, the disappearing pig trick is not an option here. Overall, I found this arcade take on Willow to be an absolute blast, even if I probably had to spend the virtual equivalent of an entire month's worth of allowance money on the quarters needed to get through it for my first time. That being said, the difficulty is actually pretty reasonable in the grand scheme of Capcom games of that era, with tough but fair checkpoint placements, and it especially feels more doable once you come to grips with the upgrade purchasing. It's kind of an obscure cabinet to find, and unfortunately didn't receive any ports to home consoles, even though its look and feel seemed like it would have found a perfect home on the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis. But I imagine licensing costs and fading relevance of the movie in the early 90s made it a no-go, and also a likely reason why it's never been re-released in later Capcom compilations either. But if you have the means to try it out and you dig arcade action platformers at all, definitely give it a spin sometime. And finally, we have arrived at the last and probably most well-known game of the bunch, Willow on the NES. Also developed and published by Capcom, and first released in Japan in July of 1989, with a December release that year in North America, and also getting a PAL release many years later in April of 1993. This time around, the Gameplay Foundation embraces an action RPG framework, with a much longer-lasting adventure with some obvious bits of the original Zelda on its sleeve, and perhaps some classic East games as well, but also setting itself apart in some interesting ways, all while taking unarguably the most drastic creative liberties with the source material. You play as Willow Ufgood through the game's entirety, but his journey doesn't begin with Allura, and instead he is plopped into the role of a warrior of prophecy who is the only hope against stopping the evil Bavmorda, and he sets off with some magic acorns and a sword given to him by his neighbors Von Carr and the village elder. From here on, it becomes fairly apparent that the story here isn't going to follow along with the movie plot very closely, and this game almost feels like it might have been just a previously existing game project for Capcom that eventually absorbed the Willow licensing by pasting in some characters, locations, and some of the creatures here and there. But the result isn't necessarily a bad thing at all, even if you are a big Willow fan, as it leads to a few surprises in the unfolding events, and all while still letting you have that nostalgic moment of pointing at the screen with glee when one of your favorite characters shows up. It also gives a lot more creative leeway with introducing new creatures and characters, like a weird pterodactyl-ass thing named Poe that helps you quickly travel around the rather expansive game world, or my personal favorite additions, the two bird warrior dudes named a Dick and a Bang. I am a mature adult. The game overall will probably last between 4 to 10 hours, depending on how quickly you like to play this kind of title, so I won't take too much time getting into the details of every little fetch quest and interaction, but I'll instead give a general overview into the overall structure and framework of game progression here. Similar to The Legend of Zelda, it's a top-down hack-and-slash action-adventure, with the game world split up into a large map of single screens. You can equip yourself with a sword, shield, and a magic spell, with quite a large variety of each that are collected throughout the course of the game, and notably never purchased, as there is no form of currency here. This game also has an experience point-based leveling system, with increasing levels making all those wonderful stat numbers go up, and also importantly increasing your efficiency with slashing, and more powerful, heavier swords acquired will need an appropriate level to swing them at a useful speed. Monster encounters are random, but fairly frequent, with a very dramatic music change and wiggly graphics across the entire landscape, signifying their dangerous approach. A few recognizable creatures show up from the movie at times, like the death dogs and trolls. There are also plenty of other odd things to dispatch, like floating skulls, giant bugs, two-headed ogres, zombies that turn you into a pig, or these giant rock face things. Some are definitely deadlier than others, and if you wander too far off without taking a little extra time to grind some experience points, you might be in trouble. Dying gives you a password, and there's no save function available, and while you don't lose any items or story progress from a death, you do lose any experience gained since the last safe place you were at. And while at this point it may be easy to dismiss Willow as a Zelda clone with some grinding tacked on, exploration of Willow's world does differentiate quite a bit in a few ways. It does have a handful of small villages scattered about, some with several NPCs that either hint at your next objective, let you rest your weary bones, spout off some random lore, or hook you up with a new item. Beyond the villages, you'll find forests, mountains, and caves, which are often fairly maze-like, but they won't rely much on secret hunting. You basically just need to wander around to track down the next key item, NPC interaction, or maybe a boss battle. One small warning though, not every item is necessarily mandatory, so it can be easy to miss a helpful spell or equipment upgrade if you're not thorough. But in general, the game does a pretty good job of gating off the world into sections based on what items you found or bosses you've taken down. And with a few exceptions, you shouldn't have to backtrack too much, unless you're just completely lost. But luckily, that pterodactyl friend serves as an eventual fast travel mechanic. But even if you are lost, wandering this world is an absolute pleasure. The graphics and sound are really well done for the era, with very colorful and detailed sprites, and some really nice attention to detail in some of the environments. I also really enjoyed the presentation of the NPC interactions, with their ornate frames, character portraits, and of course those little chibi sprites for the full view of the scene. Admittedly, there's some awkward translations that do muddy the immersion at times. I must also mention Harumi Fujita's soundtrack being an absolute standout in Capcom's NES works, and it really helps gel the whole experience into a grand and epic adventure with its memorable and very hummable themes, on top of some creative sound transitions that have the music fade in and out as you leave and enter different areas of the world. Willow also has a nice and malleable level of challenge to it, requiring a good amount of grit and perseverance to get through some of the more difficult areas, some patience in thoroughly exploring everything, and if things get too punishing, you can always just take a little extra time to grind out an extra experience level or two. Shout out to the 600 crabs I murdered at Lake Chief. And I also appreciate that it's not an overly long game, and thanks to the password feature, you can probably knock this one out in a weekend or two, which also makes it a fun one to revisit once every few years like I tend to do. It's an easy recommendation for me for anyone looking for a quality action RPG on the NES, and also notable as being one of the higher quality movie licensed games for the console. So beyond these 3 games, there haven't been any other attempts to bring back Willow into the world of video gaming, which probably isn't a big surprise, as the franchise in general has basically been dormant, other than the recently attempted TV series, which only got 8 episodes before stopping production and was quickly erased from the Disney Plus streaming platform. And I'd have to guess the cost for licensing Willow would outweigh the potential payoff for developing something new. But stranger things have happened, I guess. At least we have 3 different adventures to dig into, each wildly different and interesting in their own ways, and hopefully I could help shed some light on a version new to you, or at least rekindle some nostalgic memories of the glory days of 80s fantasy action. Thank you so much for watching, and if you dug this, check out some similar movie game retrospectives I've done for Gremlins and Beetlejuice. We'll catch you next time.